Washington did not win the Revolution by winning most of his battles. He won because Britain could never destroy his army. That sentence sounds simple, but it explains almost everything about the American War of Independence. George Washington was not the flawless battlefield genius of marble statues and schoolbook paintings. He lost New York. He lost Philadelphia. He retreated across New Jersey. He watched men freeze, desert, starve, and go home when their enlistments expired. He commanded an army that often lacked shoes, powder, pay, food, tents, blankets, and sometimes even the basic confidence that the cause would survive another month. Yet he understood the one truth Britain never fully solved. The British did not need to win battles. They needed to end the rebellion. Washington did not need to conquer an empire. He needed to keep an army alive long enough for the empire to lose patience. When the Continental Congress gave Washington command in 2T Civil, the title sounded larger than the reality. The Continental Army was not a modern national army. It was a fragile coalition of state troops, local militia, short-term volunteers, men with different equipment, different training, and different loyalties. Many enlisted for months, not years. When their term ended, they could simply leave. A commander could win an engagement in October and discover in December that half his army had gone home. Britain, by contrast, possessed the most powerful navy on earth, professional soldiers, experienced officers, money, global bases, and the ability to hire German auxiliaries. British commanders were trained to think in terms of decisive campaigns: occupy major cities, destroy rebel armies, restore royal authority, force submission. Washington learned quickly that he could not fight that kind of war on British terms. The lesson arrived brutally in Time CLOC. At Long Island, British forces outmaneuvered his army and nearly trapped it against the East River. The American position came close to disaster. Had the British pressed hard enough at the right moment, the Continental Army might have been destroyed before independence was even a year old. Instead, Washington executed one of the most important retreats in American history. Under cover of darkness and fog, he moved thousands of men, horses, supplies, and artillery across the river to Manhattan. By morning, the British discovered that the rebel army they had hoped to crush was gone. That escape did more than save lives. It taught Washington the logic of the war. Survival was strategy. A European general might have been ashamed of retreat. Washington turned retreat into a tool. He began to fight like a man who understood that preserving the army mattered more than defending every mile of ground. If he stood and was destroyed, the revolution would end. If he withdrew and remained dangerous, the revolution continued. That is why British commanders so often misunderstood him. They saw retreat and called it weakness. They saw caution and called it cowardice. They captured cities and assumed they were winning. Washington measured the war differently. New York could fall. Philadelphia could fall. But as long as the army remained in the field, the Declaration of Independence was not just paper. This approach has often been compared to the Fabian strategy, named after the Roman commander Fabius Maximus, who resisted Hannibal by refusing to offer the decisive battle Hannibal wanted. Fabius harassed, delayed, shadowed, and survived. Washington adapted a similar logic to the American landscape. Let Britain hold cities. Let Britain march. Let Britain spend. Let Parliament grow tired. Let distance and time do damage. But Washington was not passive. He knew survival alone was not enough. An army that only retreated would lose faith. Congress would panic. Civilians would shift loyalty. Soldiers would refuse to re-enlist. At the right moment, he needed victories dramatic enough to change morale without risking destruction. That is what made Trenton so important. By December 77, the revolution was nearly dead. The British had taken New York. Washington's army had retreated through New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Enlistments were about to expire. Many men were freezing, hungry, barefoot, and exhausted. The British believed the rebellion was collapsing. Hessian troops were spread in winter outposts across New Jersey, including Trenton. Washington saw a chance. On Christmas night, He crossed the icy Delaware River with about 2,400 mi. The operation nearly failed before it began. Ice choked the water. Boats struggled in darkness. Horses panicked. Artillery had to be ferried across. 2 other American columns failed to cross. Washington's force was late, exposed, and marching through a winter storm. But he pushed forward. At Trenton, the Americans struck the Hessian garrison by surprise. The fight was short, sharp, and stunning. Hundreds of prisoners were taken. American losses were light. More important than the tactical result was the psychological shock. The army that everyone thought was dying had attacked on Christmas and won. Trenton proved Washington still had teeth. A week later, he did something even more revealing. Lord Cornwallis moved to trap him near Trenton, with Washington's army positioned behind a Sunpink Creek. Cornwallis believed he could finish the Americans in the morning. But Washington did not wait to be finished. That night, he left fires burning in camp and ordered men to make noise as if they were digging defensive works. Cannon wheels were muffled. The army slipped away through the darkness on frozen roads and marched toward Princeton. By morning, Cornwallis found an empty camp. Washington had escaped and struck another British position. Princeton was not a giant battle, but together with Trenton, it changed the emotional weather of the war. Soldiers re-enlisted. Civilians regained confidence. Congress breathed again. Britain had not lost the war, but it had lost the illusion that Washington was finished. This was Washington's method at its best: refuse destruction. Strike the vulnerable point, vanish before the enemy can use superior strength. That same logic ran through the darker months that followed. At Valley Forge in the winter of 77, Washington's army did not win a battlefield victory. It endured. The camp became a symbol because it revealed the price of survival. Men lacked shoes and proper clothing. Food shortages produced desperation. Disease killed more effectively than British bullets. Yet the army remained together. And something changed there. With the arrival of Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the army began to professionalize. Von Steuben drilled the troops, standardized movements, taught bayonet use, and imposed a discipline that gave Washington something he had not possessed at the beginning of the war: a force that could stand more reliably against British regulars. The army that left Valley Forge was still underfunded and imperfect, but it was no longer only a collection of desperate amateurs. Washington also fought a hidden war. He understood intelligence better than many commanders of his age. His spy networks in and around British-occupied New York gave him eyes inside the enemy's most important base. Civilians, merchants, riders, boatmen, and couriers moved information through secret routes, codes. False names, invisible ink, and dead drops helped transform ordinary people into a nervous system of the revolution. Washington did not merely collect information. He used deception as a weapon. He allowed false reports to reach British hands. He made his army look stronger than it was. He concealed intentions. He turned British uncertainty into time. The greatest example came in Yao Tse Bayou. By then, Cornwallis was in Virginia at Yorktown. Washington was outside New York with French forces under Rochambeau. A direct move south could have warned the British commander in New York, Henry Clinton, giving him time to reinforce Cornwallis or attack American positions in the north. Washington needed Clinton to believe New York remained the target. So he created the appearance of a campaign that did not exist. He prepared false signals. He allowed misleading plans to be seen. He moved troops in ways that suggested an attack on New York. Clinton believed the threat. While British attention remained fixed there, Washington and Rochambeau marched south with speed and secrecy. The trap at Yorktown required more than Washington. It required French troops, French money, and most importantly, French naval power under Admiral de Grasse, whose fleet blocked the Chesapeake. When the British could not rescue Cornwallis by sea, the trap closed. American and French forces laid siege. Artillery battered the British lines. Redoubts were stormed. Cornwallis attempted escape and failed. In October, his army surrendered. The world turned upside down not because Washington had finally become the kind of general Britain expected. It turned because he never became that general. He did not give Britain the clean, decisive battle it wanted when the odds favored Britain. He preserved his army. He struck isolated posts. He retreated when necessary. He accepted political criticism. He let cities fall when he could not save them. He relied on intelligence, alliance, endurance, and timing. That is why Washington's strategy can feel frustrating if judged only by battlefield scorecards. He lost more often than Americans like to remember. But war is not a scoreboard of isolated battles. War is the relationship between military force and thousand. Political will, resources, geography, morale, and time. Washington understood the relationship better than his enemies. Britain had to prove rebellion was hopeless. Washington had to prove it was not. Every month he stayed in the field, he proved that point again. Every retreat that saved the army denied Britain final victory. Every surprise attack reminded Americans that the cause still breathed. Every deception forced the British to guard against possibilities that may not have been real. Every alliance move widened the war beyond Britain's ability to control cheaply. The British came to America expecting subjects who would submit after enough punishment. Washington gave them a war of endurance. They expected a rebel army that could be cornered. Washington became a ghost. They expected cities to decide the war. Washington made the army. Not the city, the heart of the revolution. This is the Washington Americans should remember. Not just the man on horseback. Not just the marble founder. Not just the face on money. The real Washington was a commander under pressure, often uncertain, often criticized, sometimes defeated, but rarely confused about the central task. Keep the army alive. Keep the cause alive. Make Britain pay for time. Wait for the moment when a small victory, a foreign alliance, a naval opportunity, or a British mistake could change everything. That strategy was not glamorous. It was cold. Hungry, muddy, humiliating, and slow. But it worked. Washington did not defeat the British Empire by overpowering it. He defeated it by refusing to disappear. He made Britain chase him across rivers, through winters, into false threats, and finally into a trap at Yorktown. The empire wanted one decisive blow. Washington gave it years of frustration. And in the end, frustration did what one battlefield could not. It wore the empire down. The most difficult part of this strategy was not military. It was political. A commander can tell himself that retreat is wise. It is much harder to convince hungry soldiers, frightened civilians, impatient congressmen, and angry newspaper writers that retreat is part of a plan. Americans wanted proof that independence was not a fantasy. Washington often had to give them patience instead. That made his position almost impossible. If he fought too aggressively and lost the army, the revolution died. If he refused to fight at all, the revolution might die from despair. He had to balance preservation with action, caution with drama, survival with symbols. This is why the small victories mattered so much. Trenton and Princeton did not defeat the British Empire militarily. They defeated hopelessness. In a revolution, morale is not decoration. It is infrastructure. Soldiers re-enlist because they believe staying matters. Civilians supply armies because they believe the army has a future. Foreign powers help only when they believe the cause may survive. Washington's genius was understanding that the army was both a military instrument and a political symbol. When the army lived, the nation in formation lived. When the army appeared, disappeared, struck, retreated, and returned, it taught Americans a lesson they needed to believe. The British could hurt the revolution, but they could not simply end it. The British repeatedly misunderstood this because their mental map of war was different. They had spent centuries fighting for ports, capitals, fortresses, trade routes, and dynastic advantage. In that world, taking a capital mattered, seizing a city mattered, holding territory mattered. Those things mattered in America too, but not in the same way. The American rebellion was decentralized. There was no single city whose capture ended it. Congress could move. State governments could adapt. Militia could disperse and return. The countryside could remain hostile even while cities were occupied. This frustrated Britain at every level. They could take New York and still face an army outside it. They could take Philadelphia and watch Congress leave. They could win battles and discover that the rebellion had not accepted the meaning of defeat. Washington's role was to preserve that refusal. His strategy also required personal discipline. It is tempting to imagine that restraint is passive. In war, restraint can be harder than attack. A commander under criticism wants to prove himself. Washington had pride. He wanted honor. He understood reputation. But he learned to swallow the humiliation of retreat because the cause required it. That did not mean he was always right. He made mistakes. He misjudged situations. He could be stubborn. He sometimes wanted battles that carried real danger. The point is not that he was perfect. The point is that his central instinct preserved the army. Avoid annihilation. Strike when conditions favor you was strategically sound. Yorktown proved the value of that instinct. The final victory was not the product of one sudden inspiration. It was the harvest of years of survival. There could be no Yorktown if the army had been destroyed at Long Island. No Yorktown if the army dissolved after New Jersey. No Yorktown if Valley Forge broke it. No Yorktown if France decided the Americans were doomed. No Yorktown if Washington could not conceal his movement south. The surrender in Virginia was the visible ending of an invisible accumulation. Years of not dying. Years of frustrating Britain. Years of learning. Retreating, gathering intelligence, preserving alliances, and waiting for a moment when British geography, French naval power, and American endurance could meet in one place. That is what makes Washington's strategy relevant beyond the 18th century. It is a lesson in asymmetric war. A weaker side does not always need to defeat the stronger side everywhere. It needs to identify what the stronger side requires for victory and deny it. Britain required a decisive end. Washington denied decisiveness. Britain required Americans to accept defeat. Washington kept giving Americans reasons not to accept it. This is also why the story resonates with American identity. The revolution was not born from permanent confidence. It was born from repeated near failure. The country did not emerge because everything went right. It emerged because enough people, under enough pressure, refused to let the cause disappear. Washington became the symbol of that refusal, not because he never lost, because he did not let loss become final. That is a more useful kind of heroism. It does not tell people they will always win. It tells them that survival, discipline, adaptation, and patience can keep a future open until the right opportunity arrives. The British chased an army. They were really chasing time. And time was the one battlefield Washington understood better than they did. This is also why Washington's leadership cannot be separated from character. Strategy on paper is easy. Endurance in front of disappointed men is hard. Washington had to absorb blame without letting it reshape the central plan. He had to write letters asking for supplies that did not come, calm officers who wanted more aggressive action, and persuade civilians that the army's suffering still served a purpose. He was not merely commanding troops. He was holding together a political experiment that had no guarantee of success. The British often assumed American weakness would eventually explain itself. Short enlistments would dissolve the army. Inflation would break Congress. Regional jealousies would divide the states. Loyalists would rally. France would hesitate. Winter would starve the camp. Any one of those assumptions might have become true. Washington's work was to prevent all of them from becoming true at the same time. That is a different kind of command from battlefield brilliance. It is the command of continuity. Keep enough men fed to stay together. Keep enough hope alive to recruit more. Keep enough pressure on Britain to make the war expensive. Keep enough dignity in defeat to make the next campaign possible. When Americans today look back at the Revolution, it is tempting to compress the story into bright moments. The Declaration, the Delaware Crossing, Valley Forge, Yorktown. But Washington lived in the long spaces between those moments. He lived in delays. shortages, bad roads, missing wagons, failed plans, rumors, resignations, jealous officers, and frightened letters from Congress. His achievement was not that he escaped those problems. It was that he kept the war coherent despite them. That makes his strategy more impressive, not less. A single spectacular victory can be remembered easily. A war of survival is harder to dramatize because its triumph is cumulative. Washington's victory was built from decisions that often looked unimpressive at the time: not fighting today, moving before dawn, hiding weakness, exaggerating strength, keeping a battered army in being, waiting for the political and international battlefield to change. In the end, Britain lost, not because it never won battles, but because its victories did not create the political result it needed. Washington lost ground, but preserved meaning. He lost cities, but preserved the army. He lost campaigns, but preserved the future. That is the deeper lesson. Sometimes the side that survives with purpose is more dangerous than the side that wins without ending the war.